Hi, this is Uboat for Grinder School, and today instead of a live video or a hand history review, I'll be talking about an underestimated and sometimes a very neglected part of poker, especially at the micros, which is the human factor of poker. It's something that I want to talk about for a while because when you see the hand histories or you see some blog posts on Grinder School, and not only in Grinder School forums, probably many other forums, people at the micros when they're trying to grind through it or get out of it, they just stick with the math and fundamentals, which is really important, but they really ignore the most important factor, which is the human element or human factor of poker. So this topic is quite important at the micros because we see many weaker opponents who never play optimally, nor applies any form of ABC poker, or they just do not know any game theory at all. Sometimes our opponents make a bet that forces us to call due to math, but in our guts we just know that we're going to lose, but we call due to pot odds, and the math of poker dictates our actions sometimes. There are many times when I was blind to the human factor and just played blindly based on the math and putting my opponents on a range that they probably are not even aware of. For example, putting opponents on a strong range just because they open at early position, while my opponent probably has no idea the proper starting hands at each specific position. Sometimes our opponents will give information, but we fail to take advantage of it because we're not playing the player. Instead, we stick to our fundamentals or ABC of poker and playing our hands like we are on autopilot. We have to always remember we are playing against other people and not robots or bots. They will make mistakes, as we often will make mistakes, but hopefully the number of mistakes that we make are much less than the mistakes made by our opponents. So it is very important to watch for spots to take advantage of. Failing to do so will prevent us from playing optimally despite our solid fundamentals that we have learned. Our opponents will give away very repetitive tendencies like bet sizing and timing tells when they have good cards or bad cards. Some people reveal information that do not represent their actions. What I mean by this is that although they make a bet or a raise or a call or a check raise, they make strange bet sizing and timing tells that they show on a consistent basis that allow us to take in the information and use it to determine their overall decision-making process and thus their range. We should be able to narrow it down if their range is strong or weak. So whenever our opponents take actions that define their range, we can make effective counteractions to exploit their tendencies. By taking these human factors into consideration, we have to try to understand how these players are thinking, and what led to their decisions. Because it is very likely that these players have no idea or have a very vague or an incorrect approach to their decision-making process. You may see some players 3-betting almost every hand pre-flop. That information should allow us to open our range and play against these players with a hand that is stronger and therefore a plus EV move. But almost every session I see regulars who have position against these players, but they just play their regular style of poker instead of adjusting to the fishy players and taking advantage of their weak tendencies. These regs are typical of many who are grinding their way up or out of the micros, if they can make it out of it at all. And their lack of adjustment and lack of observation cause them to get stuck or prolong their grind at the microstakes. These fishy players will give off other tells, like how fast and how slow they play their hands, and which hands they play it fast or slow. And using that factor to narrow their range allows us to make a call when the math tells us not to call, or to fold when the math tells us that we should call. Whenever I play live, I try not to give off tells, but I'm not a robot, and no matter how hard I try, I'll get excited or very nervous when I'm dealt a monster hand. My problem is that I start to feel warm, well, more like hot, and you can literally see my glasses fog up a bit. But thankfully, many, and I would say most of the players don't pick up that read, and they end up calling my bets down only to lose to my stronger range. So we must remember that most players at the micros are not familiar with the correct math and theory of poker. So if we play proper math against a player who have no idea what pot odds are, nor when to make the correct call, we have to consider that human factor and figure out what a small bet or a pot size bet means to these based on these players. Has these players slow played a big hand previously and made a small bet to entice me or other players? Or does he fast play his weak hands and make oddly large size bets on a dry board? We have to keep asking these questions to ourselves as we try to determine our opponent's decision-making process. And at the micros, just remember, most are thinking and looking at their cards, and they're very unlikely have considered what we may have. So taking in the human factor into the game of poker will help us to play the player based on this information, we'll be able to make the correct call or the correct fold or bet based on what we have seen and what our gut tells us based on history. And as members of Grinder School, we all study hand histories and calculate the math, and we ask questions whether our decisions was correct or not. But what most fail to remember is that when we are playing a session, we are not playing within a vacuum. A player may be tilting, running good, running bad, or just don't know how to play poker properly. When we are dealt a hand, we all face many factors other than the fundamentals that affect our decision making. There is a timer that is pressuring us to make a decision quickly before we are forced to sit out. We are also playing with real money, which gets us very excited in a bad or a good way that affect our decision-making process. We also react to others, whether it's a response on the chat box or an action taken by our opponents. These factors all contribute to the process of making a decision in addition to all the game theory we have learned or not learned. These factors prevent most players, especially at the micros, from playing optimally. So if our opponents do not play optimally, it gives us room to maneuver and outplay our opponents based on the tells or reads that they have given us in a session. Excuse me. And I always regret the times where I know I should have made a fold to a bet. My gut and my emotion are telling me to fold, but as the time is running out, I let the math take over and override any of the reads I had on a player, and I call and I get shown the nuts. And I'm hating myself for making the call, telling myself I should have gone with my gut feeling. So as we play against these weak players, playing optimally does not necessarily always mean the optimal theoretical or applying the correct math. We have these within our arsenal at the tables, but we need to learn to use the tells and reads that we have against these bad players to really beat them at the tables. If we habitually call down to the river with, if they habitually call down to the river with two pairs, we got to keep betting for value with our sets or better. And if these players only call down with a draw and never raise until they have the nuts, we have to just keep betting with our non-nutted made hands. It's a mistake not to follow through with any reads that we had. If a bad player isn't using any math or theory, then sometimes the math will backfire when playing these players. For example, they have the nuts, but they keep betting 1/3 pot size bet. And you keep calling because you have pot odds to call, but your gut tells you that you have a losing hand. So what should we do? We should just fold. The player isn't using any game theory. And when you have a read on them, we have to go with your read and your guts over the math and theory. So on this short video, I hope it kind of helped you kind of summarize, another factor, the human factor, when playing your sessions, and that we should not ignore these, especially against bad players. Against the regs, we have to use our math and we have to use our fundamentals. We have to use all the theory that we learned in grad school and from our past readings and our experience. But when we play against really bad players who are just at level 0 or 1, or who know absolutely no math and they're just playing, whatever cards that they have, we have to base our game more based on our reads to beat these players, instead of using our math and saying that, oh, geez, I'm running bad, or oh, geez, I got coolered. It's nice when you think about it. It's all part of poker. So saying that you're running bad or that you got coolered, there's no excuse sometimes, especially when you have a read against a player. So to conclude, if you have a read, go with your read, and they should override most of the things that you have learned. And remember, the math and fundamentals is very important. We need to keep that in our arsenal. But go with your read and tells when you're playing against bad players. So again, this is Uboat for Grander School, and I'll talk to you guys next time.